you. I'm very excited to be here and to be speaking with you this morning. The focus of my talk is on the results of my PhD research, looking at the family cemeteries of the Niagara Peninsula, so just the other side of the Niagara River on the Canadian side. And these are cemeteries that were created by Loyalist settlers that started arriving in the region sort of late 1700s. And I'll just go quickly over. So when I started this research, it is a degree in archaeology, but I was quite interested in how historical cemeteries and monuments could be studied to address questions of historical change, historical processes, and because it was the Niagara region settled by Loyalists, I was quite interested to see if there were ways that people were using monuments and cemeteries that spoke to their experience as settlers and how that experience was remembered and portrayed by their descendants within the region. So my approach was very much just collect any and all information about these cemeteries that I could, and as a result, the results really range in scale, and to be honest, in what people are probably going to be interested in when I talk to them about it, sort of at the most basic, narrowed-in level, looking at how families use these cemeteries, you get a really interesting family history in the differences in family decisions, circumstances, from things ranging whether or not it was adult siblings that came and settled in the region and sort of settled adjoining farms, whether you had families with, parents that came with babies or sort of children that were too young to have their own farms, and ranging from that to how long on the farm until the first person died. So there were factors along those lines that had, a great deal to do with how people started using cemeteries. But then you get into an incredible range of variability in how people then started to use these cemeteries, ranging from who was allowed to be buried there, who was excluded, how people negotiated as additional cemeteries were opened in the region, sort of negotiating the change, whether or not they reburied people from the farm to the new cemeteries. All of those kinds of relationships where there's no one set pattern in terms of how families, use these cemeteries. But when you kind of take it back another level and look at it sort of more regionally, there absolutely are patterns that emerge in how people were using these cemeteries, and a fair amount to do with sort of the creation of identity and sort of the shared use of a place and making connections both to the family farm and to those family members who are buried there. And then sort of taking it even a step more broadly in terms of archaeological thinking, there's absolutely a changing relationship between the living and the dead. So it's today I'm going to focus, I think, mainly on, I won't get too into the family stories, although those are sometimes pretty interesting, but I'll focus on sort of the conservation implications of some of these patterns that I was seeing in how people were using these cemeteries, and they absolutely tie in with the cycle of use, neglect, and renewal that was observed at the overwhelming majority of these cemeteries. And I will be the first to admit that my conservation training and work has greatly influenced my archaeological thinking regarding cemeteries and monuments. There's definitely sort of within the field of conservation the approach absolutely of the cemetery, what's the history, what's its place in the community to the people who have used it, and then the people who are now living in the community, what are the circumstances of why it's in need of whatever work it's in need of today, and how does that all factor into planning for the long-term care and best practices for that particular site. In historical archaeology, that is not the approach that's generally taken. The focus is very much on the monuments as material culture. They tend to get measured a lot, and then the studies tend to focus on measuring a range of attributes and then giving a reason why those attributes changed over time. So the monuments got bigger over time, then they got smaller because there doesn't seem to be much questioning of how did people use cemeteries to create history? What can we learn in cemeteries that isn't recorded in any other source of information? So that's really where I was sort of coming at the potential of cemeteries to contribute to historical discussion. And so very briefly, sort of in terms of sort of the methods and sample of what I did, there's a great resource in Ontario through the Ontario Genealogical Society, and volunteers with this group have been transcribing not just family cemeteries, but all cemeteries of Ontario since sort of the 1970s. And it's what's really interesting in terms of, my research that I could appreciate was they would transcribe existing cemeteries, but then in the 70s and 80s, they interviewed a lot of farmers who had been living on the land for years, and then in their 80s or 90s, having remembered, oh, I dug a grave off in that farm, or we went to that funeral, or we picked up bones when I was, when I was a kid with my brothers, kind of thing. So there's a fantastic resource of some of the sites that have been lost. And so having visited as many of them as I could, sort of in 2010, 2011, there was also this fantastic resource regarding the ones, in some cases knowing who is recorded as being buried there from records or Bibles, things like that, but no monuments left. So I think, those volunteers definitely shaved a couple years off my own research, because I could start with what they had put together over the years. And so what the research involved doing was visiting these cemeteries, and basically, again, collecting all information I could in terms of who was buried there, how were they commemorated. But what quickly became apparent were all of these really fascinating, more recent inclusions in the cemetery. Inactive cemeteries that haven't seen burials, in many generations. There are now new plaques and, heritage signs, new monuments for people who had died long ago. So there was a lot going on sort of in these places that weren't sort of the direct commemoration of people at the time of death, but sort of this continued activity in the cemetery. So gathering sort of a range of information on the sites, and then coming back and looking into the history of those families, and sort of starting with, the landowning family, and through, census, birth, marriage, death, land records, everything I could get my hands on, really coming up with sort of that traditional family tree of parents and kids and all the marriages, and really, but then add on the layer of, okay, these people are buried here, their kids are buried here, and then after a few generations, it just, explodes into where everyone's being buried. There's quite a bit of information. That's when all the really interesting family stories came out. But also it was a way to sort of track down people. I mean, when there's the same surname, that was a really good starting point, but every now and then you get someone, just one person, one name, and try and find out. In a lot of cases, they were farm workers, and sort of the grouping of neighboring families, intermarriage. So that's really when I got into people's business a little bit through the archives. And then that's really what I based a lot of my patterns on, was sort of combining the site survey and the archival research. And what this really then led to was this sort of understanding of cemetery use sort of over the generations, and how people's use and understanding of cemeteries changed. That really sort of leads to the topic looking at the use, neglect, and renewal. So I'll just really briefly go over these phases as they pertain to these family cemeteries. And what's really interesting for me in this earliest period, it's probably the time period when there's the least amount of data to actually look at, but some really interesting patterns came out in terms of where people were selecting these cemeteries and how they got them up and running. And in cases where there were wills or diaries or letters, there were several instances of people selecting their cemetery location in terms of places of meaning based on their experience on their new land. Whether it was, I'd like to be buried in the orchard that I planted, or, there's a great one, a husband and wife, when they first got their land, didn't have a house, they slept in, among the trees, and that's where they ended up putting the family burial ground. So whenever there was information on, the decisions that people were making, there's a great level of meaning and, personal history for those people. And then any sort of write-up of Upper Canadian history usually kind of gives a paragraph to family cemeteries and their place in the history of the region, and it's pretty much always the same paragraph that they were in isolated areas, they were used because there were no other options, and as soon as other options were available, people abandoned them, and they're in really rough shape now. And that quickly, I came to see that was not the case. And it was usually whenever there were cemeteries on creeks, you get one bend and here's a family, and then the other bend, oh, there's the branch of the other family. That that's not isolation or no other options. People were absolutely connecting to places with particular people of their choosing. And also in this period, there were very few monuments for the generation of loyalists themselves. Likely not commemorated in a permanent, way, such as stone, or not commemorated at all. And those that I did find, they're very, very basic inscriptions, names, dates, no record of sort of loyalist identity, and that's in great contrast to there's some churchyard cemeteries that were established sort of about this same time period of the late 1700s, and they're monuments that will have the full inscription of, this is the land I lost in the colonies, this is, you know, my military regiment that I fought in, this is the land down to lot and concession I got in Niagara, this is what happened in the War of 1812. You know, the full story is laid out in this on the monument, and so it's a really interesting, point to sort of jump off, like the differing use of public and private space, and what's sort of explicitly stated and what's sort of inherently created through use. So during this phase as well, in the mid 1800s, there was definitely then additional cemeteries that people had the option of using, and so the one absolutely overwhelming pattern is that of the 98 cemeteries, the majority of them were inactive by 1900 as families opted to use public cemeteries. There are 9 of the 98 that have had a burial since 1950. I sort of use that as a cutoff in terms of, well, if someone in their 90s was buried in 1950, there's a chance that someone's still alive. But for the most part, there haven't been burials sort of since the 1980s for quite a few of them. But what is also seen sort of stemming from this period of inactive status is sort of the overwhelming neglect of these cemeteries, and not necessarily always in sort of an intentional destruction, which there's definitely examples of that, but there's sort of the overwhelming majority is sort of this passive neglect. Families move away, and when farms were divided and either sold up or sort of retained as this one large parcel and passed on to one child, that really sort of limited. Then you can see family cemetery use along that one lineage and the others sort of moving on. So there were lots of factors at play in terms of what led to neglect. And you can see, overgrowth was probably one of the main ones that I saw in cemeteries that still have monuments. And then, many of the ones that, there are no monuments left, but there's a sign. I have no idea how big that cemetery actually is, but that's, that landowner is mowing it quite often. But there is a sign there just saying it's the place of this burial ground. So again, a bit of a range of what's seen in terms of this period of neglect. And then, though you see beginning in the 1900s, and that's when I sort of referred to, people starting to go back and add in monuments or add in history to these places, that's when you start getting this loyalist history very explicitly stated on signs, new plaques, or sort of new monuments, replica monuments, across the board. And in some cases, it's direct descendants who are involved and interested in getting this going. In other cases, it's, a municipality or a city has said, well, let's mark all the pioneer families and the cemeteries and kind of have, driving tours. So there's a range of motivations, for introducing some of these, heritage components. But what's really interesting is that for most of these, and I should say, so there's sort of that, the 9 that are being used, or have been used since 1950, there are none of these heritage, efforts going on in them, and they're also fairly well maintained. So this is really those that sort of have been lost or neglected. And what's interesting from a conservation point of view is there's usually no monuments to actually do any work with, because by the time the family kind of comes back and reclaims the space, it's gone to the point where someone else has been farming the land and cleared up the monuments, lots of records of kids with target practice, lots of inventive things that removed the visibility of the monuments from the landscape. And so you can see, I think the 2 examples on the right are new monuments. There's a new monument and a sign on the top, replacing all those that have been lost and recording the names of those buried there. But what I find fascinating, the 2 on the left, all sort of interventions sort of assume that the original material culture is going to be lost. So, there's replica monuments put up and everything else just sort of laid flat. My favorite, I think, is the boulder in the middle of a farm field is going nowhere for many, many generations. But it's just, a really interesting, comment on it's maybe more a question of as long as the visibility of these people's identity is maintained, rather than, the specific stone that was the original. It's really about so many have been lost. It's now a consideration to ensure that that at least the identities of these people are not lost, similar to so many others. And then bringing it back to sort of conservation considerations, I mean, I've really focused on, in terms of monuments and cemeteries, the cycle of use, renewal, or use, neglect, and renewal, but sort of thinking about it archaeologically and that relationship between the living and the dead, there's absolutely larger social change going on that's relating to the changing use of the space to create connections to the family farm and to the family. And as that changes, there's implications for the monument and cemetery, condition and experience. So there's a great example in a public cemetery. There was a grandson buried sort of about 1860, his name, his dates, everything. And then when I looked around the back, it was his grandfather, and I recognized the name from a farm burial. And I thought, oh, well, he's, okay, commemorated in both places. On the farm, it's his name, his dates, that's it. On his grandson's monument in the public cemetery, again, it's this full, I mean, he'd been dead for, 60, 70 years, but his grandson had decided to put, the commemoration for this man, and again, laying out his military history, his land history, very much presenting this history that, when people were buried with that group of people, that kind of interpretation and explicit display wasn't necessary, because it was a social interaction and experience of place together at that place with that group of people that really created the relationships between those people and that place. And so then just sort of considering the implications of when a cemetery shifts, in these cases family cemeteries, but you can also sort of take it to sections of a larger cemetery as the plots sort of fill up, and the next section over starts to have the burials take place. The implications of shifting from active to inactive, and people's experiences of that place, from no longer actually going there for burial and commemoration. You visit for a while, but then now you're maintaining or you move away. All of those kinds of things come into place, and then that cycles back again to once that connection is lost, and that history that was created inherently, there's something to going back. For both individuals, families, communities, going back to that space and explicitly creating it and maintaining it for generations down the line. And now this cycle, in terms of monument condition and cemetery care, is absolutely seen in like every kind of cemetery you could take a look at, from rural, urban, historical, and modern. So some of the implications from this research, not suggesting that everyone do a full regional study before any conservation of a single cemetery, but again, just the consideration of the shift from active to inactive, and is there something about the connections that were being made and how people are maintaining it in different ways that can then be used in some way in the planning for the long-term care. If there are certain connections that were being made that have been lost, that could be considered by communities now. And again, I sort of butt heads with myself in terms of the missing components, because from a conservation point of view, it's a shame to see monuments lost, but as an archaeologist, there's a fascinating story in who goes missing. Or who is not visible, never commemorated. In a lot of the, well, not a lot, but in several Niagara family cemeteries, there's evidence that they were reusing First Nations burial grounds that were on the land that they had acquired. But that doesn't come up in any of the 20th century musings of the great family history on the land. So it's interesting that way. And then again, the generation of loyalists who are missing for a century from these cemeteries are then, begin to be introduced in the 20th century. And so, there's an interesting story there of why for, 100 years did all of those grandkids and grandkids and grandkids not have the motivation or the decision or the money, whatever reason, no one put up a monument until this particular time, and in this way that introduced history in a very specific way. And then again, just some of the different, it's definitely, I think, a bit more of a challenge to explore some of the inherent connections and identity that's created. But when you start to see, history explicitly introduced by different groups, that's something that can also hopefully be considered and incorporated into any planning. So, and again, just to touch a little bit briefly too on the previous talk, that there are absolutely circumstances relating to vandalism, repairs that don't consider the historical fabric, and then maintenance and all kinds of cemetery plans that don't that don't consider, the best practices for historical, whether it's monuments, fences, the landscape, across the board. And I would just like to propose an additional factor is, that changing relationship and how people are experiencing cemeteries that not necessarily allow for those sort of less than sympathetic practices to take hold, but there's another level going on in terms of how people are experiencing that place, and how that changes over time, and how much of a story there is in how that happens for each specific cemetery. And I also want, the farm dogs are a whole other presentation, but I also just did want to mention, sort of as an aside, if any of you are up in Ontario, in Guelph this summer, or would like to plan to come, there's a monument conservation workshop being held at Woodlawn Cemetery, and over 2 days it's focusing on the conservation principles and theory, but then also hands-on repair techniques and materials. So if you wanted to chat with me about that, or Tamara Anson Cartwright is here as well, I'd be happy to chat with you about that. But thank you very much.